Welcome to the Business of Podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of hosting Professor Andrew Bernstein, a distinguished professor of history specializing in Japanese and environmental history at Lewis and Clark College as our esteemed guest on the podcast. Professor Andrew is the author of Modern Passings, Death Rites, Politics and Social Change in Imperial Japan, and Fuji, a Mountain in the Making, a new environmental and cultural history of Japan's iconic mountain. His teaching and research examines how people sustain connections to the past amid rapid social and environmental change. Professor Bernstein earned his PhD and MA from Columbia University and his BA from Amsterdam College. In today's episode, Professor Andrew shares key insights from his acclaimed book, Fuji, a Mountain in the Making, a panoramic biography of Japan's iconic mountain, tracing its story from the Ice Age to the present. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Bernstein to the conversation. Professor Andrew, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm always happy to talk about Fuji.
Thank you. Professor, Mount Fuji has been called a panoramic biography subject in your book, stretching from the Ice Age to the present. How did you decide to write the life story of a mountain rather than a conventional national or political history?
So when I began researching Fuji about 20 years ago, I didn't set out initially to write an interdisciplinary biography stretching over tens of thousands of years. My interest was a bit more limited. Back then, I was interested primarily in the impact of state regulations in late 19th century Japan, and then US occupation policies in the 1940s on the management and ownership of temple and shrine lands throughout Japan. And in the course of my research, I stumbled across a strange legal and political battle over who owned the summit of Fuji, a Shinto shrine at the base of the mountain that was dedicated to the deity of Fuji, or the Japanese state. Now, before and during World War II, this was a moot issue because the shrine, like Shinto shrines around Japan, was considered to be property of the state. So the summit belonged to the shrine and the state at one and the same time, making it necessary after the war, when the US occupation ordered a strict separation of religion and the state, to, for the first time, really draw clear boundaries between what would be considered religious or ritual precincts and state property. Again, this is throughout Japan, and in many cases, this was quite straightforward, but it became trickier when dealing with natural features like mountains, right? What qualified as religious, legally speaking, and what didn't. And the conflict over Fuji was especially charged since it was Japan's preeminent national symbol. So I gave a presentation on this conflict at an academic conference as part of a panel called Sacred Mountains in 20th Century Japan. And after I'd finished, someone asked what I considered to be a really odd question at the time, which was, but where's the mountain? And what he meant was, how did Fuji's specific qualities as a mountain, in the case of Fuji, this meant its specific qualities really as a volcano, play into the story I had just told? And again, I thought this was odd because my story was one about a territorial dispute that reflected broader disagreements concerning the relationship between religion and the state in post-war Japan. But I have to say that the question stuck with me. It just kept coming up in my mind. So I thought, okay, what about Fuji's nature as a mountain, and more specifically a volcano? And how did the fact that it was a volcano affect the way people interacted with Fuji over time? And before I knew it, I'd embarked on a crazy 2-decade-long project to understand Fuji as a product of, an actor in, both the physical world and the human imagination from its geological origins to the present. Now, I should say that plenty of people have written about Fuji over the years from all sorts of angles. So volcanologists have, of course, studied its eruptions, art historians, its place in paintings and woodblock prints, and scholars of religion, its history as a pilgrimage site. But what I decided to do is bring the different Fujis together, you could say, right? Showing how we really can't understand one aspect of Fuji without understanding the others. And this meant investigating the intersection of a wide range of phenomena, such as gender relations, geopolitics, national identity, artwork, and religious beliefs. I'd say that Fuji is particularly attractive as an historical subject for a number of reasons. A simple one is that it's famous throughout the world. Most people around the world know Fuji. When I wrote the book, I had general readers, not just fellow academics in mind, and I thought that focusing on a mountain as famous as Fuji would be a useful hook to introduce people to various aspects of Japanese history over thousands of years. Also, because of Fuji's fame, a tremendous amount of written and visual material has been produced about it. So I could draw on everything from archaeological records to poems to woodblock prints to peasant petitions. Another advantage of studying Fuji to understand both Japanese history and more generally the ways in which people project fantasies onto non-humans of all sorts is its history as one of the world's most recognizable national symbols. On the one hand, the book shows that the picture postcard image of Fuji as a wonder of nature and representation of the Japanese nation obscures a long history of upheaval and conflict. And on the other hand, it shows how this idealized image of Fuji developed over time. And the fact that Fuji is not only a volcano, but a relatively young and recently active volcano also attracted me to the idea of writing a history or biography of the mountain. All features of what we call the natural world are historical actors in one way or another, but the fact that Fuji has erupted multiple times over recent centuries makes it an especially prominent one.
Professor, you describe Fuji as both an active volcano and lofty cultural icon. What surprised you most when you started to put its geological history and its cultural history into the same narrative frame?
I'd say there were all sorts of surprises during the course of my research, but the first and most important discovery was that Fuji, or at least the Fuji we see today, didn't precede the humans who interacted with it, but grew up among them. It's thought that humans first came to Japan from the Korean Peninsula about 38 to 40,000 years ago. And what volcanologists call New Fuji, that is, the volcanic edifice or cone that we see today, began taking shape only about 17,000 years ago and became especially active around 11,000 years ago. So Fuji made history together with humans. It wasn't a mere backdrop for a history determined exclusively by humans. And this made it not just possible, but ultimately necessary to tell its geological and cultural history in the same narrative frame.
Professor, the popular image of Fuji is serene and beautiful. Yet, you highlight episodes of violent eruptions, famine, and fear. Which historical moment best captures this darker, more threatening side of this mountain?
So I'll choose two historical moments, if that's okay. One of them, not really a moment, but an extended period of time from the 8th to the 11th centuries when Fuji was particularly active, and the other being Fuji's most recent eruption, the so-called Hoi eruption of 1707. Again, from the 8th to 11th centuries, Fuji erupted quite frequently. So it was during that period of time, what's referred to as Japan's Heian period, when the imperial capital was in the city of Heian, now known as Kyoto, that Fuji was regarded not only as a lofty and sublime mountain like we see in poetry from the time, but also as a fearsome deity that had to be placated through rituals and prayers. And when it did erupt, priests in charge of worshiping Fuji were blamed for not praying hard enough. What's interesting is that Fuji was also associated with disease, which is something I didn't expect until I came across these records, showing that its eruptions were frequently interpreted as signs of impending epidemics. And these could easily spread throughout the country and were ultimately more threatening to courtiers in far-off Heian than Fuji's eruptions were. So in terms of both its physical and cultural impact, Fuji's volcanism from the 8th to 11th centuries, that is, during Japan's Heian period, was highly significant. Now, Fuji quieted down for the next few centuries, but it erupted violently again in 1707. And this Hoi eruption was significant both in terms of physical damage and what it revealed about the political and moral economy of the time. This eruption buried nearby villages in as much as 3 meters of debris and spewed up to 8 centimeters of ash over 100 kilometers away, burying agricultural fields and wreaking havoc on flood control and irrigation systems that took decades, and in the case of a couple of villages, over a century to repair. And these flood control and irrigation systems had boosted agricultural production dramatically during the preceding centuries. So the eruption, by destroying them, really showed just how vulnerable they really were. Now, at the time of the eruption, power was wielded on a national level by a military government, or shogunate, that is, a shogun's government, which was established at the start of the 17th century by the Tokugawa family. And this national government oversaw foreign relations and implemented certain rules, like a ban on Christianity, that had to be enforced throughout Japan. But at the same time, most of the country consisted of semi-autonomous domains ruled by samurai lords known as daimyo. This power-sharing arrangement between daimyo and the shogunate remained largely intact for about 2.5 centuries, so it was largely successful. But like any political system, it had its tensions and contradictions on both the local and national level. Generally speaking, domains were supposed to run their own affairs, which included providing relief during disasters and particularly during famines. But what happened when a domain government didn't have the resources to meet the needs of its subjects? Or what happened if a disaster affected multiple domains? In the case of the Hoei eruption, the domain that suffered the largest impact was the Odawara domain, which didn't have sufficient resources to help peasants who repeatedly appealed for help. And they repeatedly appealed both for rice, right, food, as well as emergency funds to bring their fields back into production. So in response, because the Odawara domain wasn't able to really meet the needs fully of its subjects, the shogun's government expropriated over half of the domain, which gave it direct control over relief efforts, especially the reconstruction of burst levees along rivers. And it also took the extraordinary step of instituting a tax across all of Japan for those efforts. And this was unprecedented, in fact. So I'd say that in this instance, the shogunate showed the flexibility and will to overcome structural limitations, to muster a response that helped diminish the death toll and put fields back into production. That said, the relief offered by the shogun's government was inadequate to keep many people from starving. So villages repeatedly petitioned officials in the years and decades following the eruption to provide more. And what we see here, I think, is a real faith in the written word to get things done. In his well-known book, Seeing Like a State, James Scott shows how states try to make populations what he calls legible, that is, visible, in order to extract resources from them. But the flip side of this legibility, at least in Tokugawa, Japan, was that people could make themselves legible to hold the state accountable. The thinking was, if we show you our suffering, you have to do something about it. And in pushing for assistance, they always invoke the virtue of benevolence or compassion. According to the Confucian worldview at the time, subjects were expected to obey their rulers, but in turn, rulers were expected to care for their subjects. The shogunate and domain governments repeatedly stressed Confucian teachings to legitimize their power, but invoking the ideal of benevolence was a way for Tokugawa period Japanese to hold their lords to their ideological word. If petitions didn't work, they'd sometimes march to the domain castle or even threaten to go to the seat of the shogun's government in Edo, which is today known as Tokyo. And this happened in the weeks following the eruption. So responses to the eruption clearly reveal the tensions of a political and moral order in which the shogun shared power with the daimyo of several hundred domains, but operating with an increasingly nationalized context. And here I should add that the eruption also demonstrates the degree to which empirical observations of natural phenomena had taken hold in Tokugawa, Japan. In fact, this is interesting, the precision and profusion of records concerning the Hoei eruption have allowed volcanologists today to construct a timeline of events down to the half hour and to use that timeline to create hazard maps to prepare for similar eruptions in the future. So the Hoei eruption is significant not only for what it teaches us about Tokugawa Japan, but also for helping scientists and government officials today both model and prepare for possible eruptions in the future. So that's my very long answer to your short question.
Professor, over the centuries, Fuji has been home to shifting deities and religious practices, from Buddhist and Shinto traditions to Fujiko pilgrimage groups. What does this constant reinvention of the sacred tell us about Japan's changing spiritual landscape?
Well, this reinvention of the sacred clearly shows that Fuji, which is now portrayed as a unifying and timeless symbol, or even totem, you could say, of the Japanese nation, has always been not only physically, but culturally in flux. As I mentioned earlier, from the 8th to 11th centuries, Fuji was regarded as a violent deity who caused both eruptions and epidemics. But in the 12th century, a chapel to the Buddha, Dainichi, the sun or cosmic Buddha, was established by an ascetic on the summit. And this ascetic also established a temple at the base of the mountain for fellow ascetics that developed over time into a pilgrimage site. And pilgrimage to Fuji really took off during Japan's Tokugawa period, which I mentioned earlier, which lasted from 1600 to 1868. And during that time, Fuji could be seen from Edo, the shogun's capital, and this is today Tokyo. So you can see Fuji from Tokyo today. And as Fuji grew over time, so did worship groups, these Fujiko that you mentioned. And these Fujiko groups met monthly in people's homes and also sent members on pilgrimage to Fuji during the summer. The leaders of these groups, and significantly, these were groups formed by lay people. Right? There was not a formal priesthood. These were lay people who had leaders, but they were not officially part of the clergy. These groups taught that Fuji was the origin of the cosmos and was imagined to be what they called the original father and mother of the world. And in fact, the mountain was imagined in bodily terms. There are caves, for example, at the base of the mountain called tainai, or wombs. Pilgrims would enter them and drink or collect water, seeping into the caves that was compared to breast milk. It was thought that pregnant women who drank Fuji water would have a safe childbirth, and that the water had healing powers in general. So we've come a long way, haven't we, from Fuji as a violent, fearsome deity to one who creates, nourishes, and heals. And I think what's striking also is that the Hoei eruption, which I just talked about earlier, isn't even mentioned in Fujiko writings, which focus pretty much exclusively on Fuji as a benevolent parent of the cosmos. I should add that it was also during the Tokugawa period that Japanese nativism took hold, and this would really affect also how Fuji was imagined. Adherents of a school of thought called Kokugaku, or national learning, researched ancient texts at the time to really discover, in their view, what made Japan unique. And in the process, they invented a modern idea of Shinto, which means the way of the gods, as the true, pure religion of Japan. And to them, Buddhism was something foreign, even though it had been thoroughly integrated into Japanese institutions and everyday lives for centuries. And in fact, a number of Fujiko teachings and practices were inspired by Buddhism. And Fujiko members referred to the Fuji deity as Great Bodhisattva Sengen, using this explicitly Buddhist terminology to describe the god of Fuji. Now, nativists looking to Shintoize Japan instead declared that the Fuji deity was actually Konohana Sakuyahime. I realize that's a mouthful. It just means the princess of the flowering tree blossoms. And she's a goddess who appears in the ancient imperial chronicles. But in those chronicles, she has nothing to do with Fuji at all. There's no relationship. So in the Tokugawa period, we see Fuji being repurposed, you could say, by nativists for nationalistic ends. Now, after the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown in 1868, many officials in the new imperial government were sympathetic to nativist teachings. And right away, they mandated the separation of Buddhism from Shinto around Japan, even though local worship of deities had been completely thoroughly integrated with Buddhism for centuries in Japan. Now, at Fuji, the separation meant the Shintoization, or you could say de-Buddhification, if you can make that a term, of religious institutions around the mountain and of the mountain itself. So, for example, Buddhist icons on the mountain were removed or destroyed, and a gate that contained Buddhist guardian kings on the approach to a major shrine at the base of the mountain was completely destroyed. So, the reinvention of the sacred shows that Fuji has been a source not only of spiritual unity, but also radical change and discord. Here I should add that as time passed, sacred Fuji also became a major feature of Japanese popular culture through woodblock prints, through games, clothing, and other consumer items. So by the end of the Tokugawa period, it had come to be seen as an emblem, or really the embodiment of the nation of Japan. And after the fall of the shogunate in 1868, the new government, which was intent on transforming Japan into a modern nation state and empire, took advantage of this fact to promote nationalism among the Japanese people. For instance, by featuring Fuji as the pride of Japan in school books designed to teach children how to read. And what's interesting is in those school books, we don't see any reference to the deity Konohana Sakyahime, or Shinto institutions, or Shinto practices on, around, and around the mountain at all. Fuji was simply cast as a part of Japan that stood for all of Japan, and it was depicted as a steady and unifying force that linked past to present through both its cultural history and its physical presence. So you could say, in a sense, that Fuji remained sacred, right, as a national symbol, but stripped, in fact, of specific Shinto ideas that had been propagated by nativists.
Proposing write about debates over who actually owns Fuji, including conflicts between the state and religious institutions. How do ownership disputes over a sacred mountain illuminate broader struggles over authority and identity in modern Japan?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I first came to study Fuji by focusing on a particular dispute in post-World War II Japan over whether the summit should be controlled by a Shinto shrine at the base of the mountain called Fujisan Hongu Sengen Taisha, or the state. And here I should say the Tokugawa government had recognized the authority of the shrine over the summit. And between the 1870s and end of World War II, whether the summit was controlled by the shrine or the state, as I said earlier, was a moot issue, yeah? Since the shrine's lands were considered the property of the state and the shrine at one and the same time. But US occupation officials mandated, again, as I mentioned earlier, a strict separation of religion and the state. So a committee was put together by the finance ministry to decide whether the summit was indeed the private property of Fujisan Hongu Sengen Taisha or the public property of the Japanese people. This committee also had to contend with the fact that the mountain was split between two prefectures, Shizuoka Prefecture to the south and Yamanashi Prefecture to the north, with the summit being in a kind of no man's land between the two prefectures. Now, the shrine at the center of the conflict was located, and is located, it continues to be located, in Shizuoka Prefecture. So communities in Yamanashi Prefecture, as well as the Yamanashi prefectural government, opposed the shrine's bid for control. And here I should say that this opposition had its roots in centuries-old conflicts over the summit. These were primarily economic disputes over who could profit from the money spent by pilgrims. By the time we get to the post-war era, however, Fuji had come to be seen as the preeminent symbol of Japan, so a provincial conflict became a national concern. Yeah? Now, the shrine and its allies argued that since the Tokugawa and imperial governments had recognized the shrine's authority over the summit, so too should Japan's post-war government. But there were many in Japan who argued that Shinto institutions and beliefs had supported the pre-war authoritarian government. So in a new democratic Japan, the summit should be regarded as a secular space that belonged to all of the Japanese people, not to a specific Shinto shrine. Here, I can't give all the twists and turns, but the matter was taken up by Japanese politicians and then the court system, with Japan's Supreme Court ruling in the 1970s that the summit indeed belonged to the shrine. And this continues to be true today. I think, therefore, that this conflict clearly shows that Fuji's status as a national symbol has not only made it a source of unity, but a lightning rod for conflicts over what the nation was and should be.
Professor, one of the striking contrasts in the book is between Fuji's sublime image and the reality of military training grounds, industry, and mass tourism on its slopes. How has economic development literally and symbolically reshaped the mountain?
Well, as you point out, the contrast between Fuji's image and its economic and military exploitation is quite stark. Over the past several centuries, as Fuji was extolled as the pride of Japan and a wonder of nature, a number of industries cropped up at the base of the mountain to produce commodities sold both domestically and abroad. And these famously include silk, tea, and paper. And the production of all these has depended on the steady supply of water that originates with the rain and snow that falls on Fuji and makes its way to the base, where it appears in the form of springs, rivers, and lakes. Now, today, because of global competition, the silk industry is a mere shadow of its former self. But the production of tea and paper continues to thrive. In my book, I especially focus on the development of the paper industry between Fuji and Suruga from the late Tokugawa period to show how Fuji was globalized, not only through its representations, but also through its entanglement in international commodities networks. So, for example, paper produced at the foot of Fuji in the early 20th century won prizes at international competitions. And as time passed, the paper mills turned from using timber from forests on and around Fuji to importing wood chips from abroad, primarily from Southeast Asia. It's also important to note that the industry polluted Suruga to the point that it was featured in a Godzilla film in the early 1970s called Godzilla versus Hedorah. This monster, Hedorah, grows from the sludge in Suruga and feeds on the smoke released from factories on shore. And of course, this being a Godzilla film, Godzilla defeats Hedorah. But the end of the movie makes clear that another monster could appear if humanity doesn't deal with pollution. I should add that the paper industry, in response to national regulations and popular pressure, did take measures to reduce pollution, but the bay is still heavily contaminated. And the use of so much groundwater by paper mills has caused the water table to fall significantly. And meanwhile, much of Fuji's lower skirt has been militarized. In the early 20th century, the Imperial Army established artillery ranges and training grounds in these huge grasslands at the base of the mountain. And then the US military took control of these military installations after World War II. Today, they're mainly used by, again, the Japanese military, but a US Marine base called Camp Fuji is still there. Now, obviously, the militarization of Fuji's grasslands has had negative ecological consequences. But in the book, I highlight the unexpected ecological benefit to endangered butterflies that depend on plants that grow in the grasslands. For centuries, locals regularly burned and mowed the grasslands, which were treated as common property. And they had to burn and mow them to keep them from turning into forest. And they used the grass for different purposes, like fodder for horses or thatch for roofs. Of course, nowadays, people don't have much need for horses or thatch in Japan. People use tractors and roof tiles. So grasslands have disappeared throughout rural Japan. But they've continued to exist at Fuji because locals burn them each spring in order to assert common land rights to ensure that the Japanese government continues to pay rental fees that allow the military to keep using them. This, in turn, creates a terrain ideal for military training and a habit for butterflies that have gone extinct in many parts of Japan. And the strange irony here is that the militarization of the grasslands is key to the survival of these butterflies. These butterflies depend indirectly on bombs, right, to continue to exist. And of course, I'm not trying to say that on balance, military activities have generated more positive ecological consequences than negative ones. I'm not trying to say that at all. But this strange relationship between militarization and butterflies, I think, does show that dedicating a terrain to military purposes is not all bad for all species. And I think this in turn speaks to the fact that non-humans like butterflies are dependent on human activities in often really unexpected and ironic ways.
You draw on environmental history to show Fuji as both life-giving and destructive, providing fertile soil and water, yet also causing ecological damage. How has this double character influenced the way Japanese communities have adapted to living with the volcano?
What I discovered in my research is that studying a volcano and its surroundings throws into especially sharp relief the adaptability of our species to a variety of environments. The story of humans can be told in the context of any place we've inhabited for long stretches of time, but because volcanoes produce tremendous differences in soil, elevation, and access to water in a relatively small area, they're especially apt to reveal one of our great strengths as a species, which is the ability to inhabit, exploit, and ultimately transform a wide range of ecological settings. Now, communities around Fuji have had to contend with destructive eruptions, but they've also benefited tremendously from Fuji's water, right? As I mentioned earlier, right? It supports the local economy through different industries. But people have also taken advantage of the volcanic terrain in very creative ways, in addition to using water. So for example, until the 1960s, locals living near a relatively young lava field that was unsuitable for agriculture or industrial purposes took advantage of the cool and steady temperatures in several of the field's caves to store silkworm eggs. And while slush flows composed of snow, volcanic debris, and water have destroyed homes and fields over the centuries, during the Tokugawa period, locals on the northern side of the mountain diverted them into hand-dug channels and then gathered the debris to create arable land on top of a nearby lava flow. So the story of physical relations between humans and Fuji is one of destruction on the one hand, but also ingenuity and innovation on the other.
Professor, Fuji's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2013 is central to your concluding chapter. In what ways has World Heritage status changed how Japanese people in the world see and manage the mountain today?
In many cases, a World Heritage Site designation lifts a place from obscurity. But the fact of the matter is, Fuji was already world famous when it was designated. And as I noted in the book, making Fuji a World Heritage Site was a bit like conferring an honorary doctorate on a scholar who had already enjoyed a long and illustrious career. The idea of getting Fuji World Heritage status originated among local organizations, a lot of them environmental organizations, that wanted to designate it a natural World Heritage Site. And here I should mention that there are three kinds of World Heritage Sites: natural, cultural, and mixed. Locals figured it made sense to make Fuji a natural World Heritage Site since it's a mountain. However, interestingly, this was rejected by a government committee that argued that there are plenty of stratovolcanoes around the world like Fuji. So its so-called natural qualities didn't make it unique enough to, to become a a World Heritage Site in the category of natural. Now, after this campaign failed, another one developed, and this one involved prominent business people and politicians, including former Prime Minister Nakasone. And these people worked to make Fuji not a natural World Heritage Site, but a cultural World Heritage Site. And they succeeded in doing this in 2013. Now, in designating the mountain a cultural World Heritage Site, promoters of World Heritage status downplayed anything that could interfere with the overall message that the relationship between the Japanese people and Fuji represents a harmonious relationship between the Japanese and nature more broadly. And if you go to the official Fujisan World Heritage Site webpage, you'll see that while Fuji is acknowledged to be a volcano, the devastating impacts of its eruptions are completely ignored. So are conflicts like the ones over who owns the summit that I explained earlier. And of course, the militarization of the grasslands is completely absent from the website. And what we get instead is this simplified picture that obscures Fuji's complex history as a site of competition, conflict, and destruction. On a positive note, working to gain World Heritage status for Fuji did encourage both local and national stakeholders to coordinate efforts to clean up trash, improve safety measures, and more closely regulate both the number and behavior of climbers.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. You argue that Fuji is always in the making and even describe it as a kind of bodyscape rather than a static landscape. What does it mean in practical terms to treat a mountain as an active participant in history rather than just a backdrop to human events?
You know, that's a good question. I think that treating a mountain, in the case of Fuji, it's a mountain that's a volcano, as an active participant in history makes us more fully aware of the complexities of our physical and imagined relationships with non-humans that cross the conventional boundary between what's called nature on the one hand and culture or human activities on the other. And this boundary that people draw between nature and humans really exists more in our heads than in reality. And foregrounding a mountain as an historical actor makes us question the idea that nature is somehow over there, somehow separate from humans. And this is why I use the term bodyscape in the book to describe Fuji. I think the word landscape implies something fixed, a scene or setting separate from humans that's taken in primarily through our eyes. While the word bodyscape acknowledges the active interplay between organic bodies, including human bodies, and geological ones, like Fuji. I think that at this point in history, when the human impact on Earth systems is so vast that many argue we've left the Holocene and entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, it's more important than ever to draw on different disciplines to better understand the complex, dynamic, and often obscured entanglements of humans and non-humans.
Thank you, Professor Andrew Bernstein, for sharing your fascinating insights into the many leaves of Mount Fuji. Your work reminds us that even the most timeless landscapes are always in motion, shaped by history, culture, and our evolving relationship with nature. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more conversations that explore the stories behind ideas, people, and places shaping our world today. Thank you once again, Professor Andrew Bernstein, for joining us and sharing your valuable insights to our audience. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.